I'm your host, Carolyn Solo, LCSW, EMDR therapist, and mom of 3 daughters. Thank you for joining me.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 92 of the Future Template Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Carolyn Solo, LCSW, PhD EMDR consultant, and mom of 3 daughters. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm excited to share some of my ramblings about play therapy in therapy intensives for adults. This is definitely not something that you hear a lot about, so I thought I'd just share my own experiences and then a little bit of the research that is out there, and hopefully this will get you thinking a little bit about what's possible. So I'd say that whenever we hear play therapy, we immediately think kids, right? Maybe teens too. I certainly have thought that and did think that for a long, long time. And many of us don't even think about integrating play therapy with EMDR at all. But I am here to tell you that those are misconceptions, right? There is research and protocols on the integration of EMDR therapy and EMDR and play therapy. I'll share some of that research. And then there's research and writing on play therapy in adults, just regular play therapy. And then I'll tell you a little bit about my experiences integrating play therapy into adult EMDR intensives. So I hope this is educational and inspiring for you all. It certainly was a lot of fun for me, your resident EMDR and research nerd, to do a bit of a deep dive and see what's out there. The March 2019 issue of Emdria's publication, Go With That magazine, which is their one I don't know if you know this, but Emdria has 2 publications. One is all about current research, and then that one's called the EMDR Research Journal or something. And then it has like peer-reviewed articles in it. And then the other one is, articles written for clinicians about lots of topics of interest, but it's not like, formal research studies. That's Go With That magazine. If you're a member of Emdria, you have online access to both, not just the current issues, but like the back catalog. So this is from March 2019, in which Go With That did an entire special issue on EMDR and play therapy. So I talk a little bit about some articles that are in that issue. So one of the articles was by Anne Beckley-Forest, who is an LCSWR, which I assume is the LCSW equivalent, and RPTS, which is a registered play therapy supervisor. And she contributed an article to the issue called Exploring the Intersection of EMDR and Play Therapy. This article talks about the challenges of engaging children and teenagers in EMDR, but honestly, many of her points resonate with adults as well, that there are challenges to engaging people with EMDR sometimes. Therapy, period, right? She states early in the article that, quote, children do the majority of their learning through action and imaginative experimentation, not through the verbal reflection or even the visual imagery that is the primary portal of processing for most adults in EMDR. Now, what's so interesting about this, I think, is that there's a lot of talk in the EMDR world. I mean, always, but I feel like I'm hearing more about it, about continuing to connect with the somatic element of processing. That the verbal element of processing is not the most important. And in fact, when we're trying to kind of get away from some of the more traditional approaches to therapy that are very, executive functioning, prefrontal cortex based, we are trying to get away from verbal processing. So when you are engaging in EMDR and you are heavily relying on verbal processing, you might not be getting the kind of results you want anyway, because I think that the relief that's somatically based, when you have somatic relief, that's the most profound for people a lot, right? Like, the somatic responses to triggers are the ones that happen before you can think them through, right? And that's what a lot of people want relief from, that like immediate reactivity that's emotional and that's like felt in the body. So, wouldn't it be great to be getting people to experience EMDR in a less cognitive and verbal way, right? She also mentions this article too, the visual, right? That a lot of children and the visual imagery might be hard. So, and there are adults that are like that too. But, adults in general probably have an overall easier time with visual imagery than kids. So she describes some common mistakes that therapists can make. She sort of describes a little scenario, vignette of an EMDR therapist trying to conduct EMDR with the child, right? So, quote, the EMDR therapist brings up the target memory verbally and then follows up with feelings faces or a cutout of the body for the assessment phase. Like, what are you feeling? Where do you feel it in your body? The child answers but appears bored or detached. Therapist does some BLS for a few sets, checks in. The child either says, oh, it's fine now, or can we stop now, or I don't want to continue. Gets right. So, I'm imagining my own child, my autistic kid, she would not be down with this at all. She would absolutely be bored, say like, can we stop this now? Or just completely disengage, right? Like these kinds of direct questions for her too, as an autistic kiddo, are like she does not respond to direct questioning. So she'd be nowhere with this. This would not be getting anywhere. And I think that's true with a lot of kids. I mean, I think sometimes in autistic kiddos, we see some of these responses like kind of heightened. But I don't think my kid's reaction is that unusual, but it certainly wouldn't work for her to take this approach. A lot of autistic kiddos don't like to identify feelings. Like if you ask my child, how are you feeling today? She's not going to say anything. Or if you do get anything out of her, it's always happy, even if she's clearly not happy, right? So that is not something that every person can respond to. And certainly a lot of children can struggle with that. So, yeah. So play therapy has long held that making a safe space for the processing of traumatic experience is like a huge tenet of the theory, right? And Beckley-Forest says that, quote, in moments of play, neural networks activate more fully and offer opportunities for more adaptive information to enter these networks. This sounds exactly like the conditions we would need for effective EMDR processing, whether you're a child or an adult, right? And then CCPT is commonly talked about in the play therapy world, child-centered play therapy. And, paramount is creating this safe space that comes through, and I quote, I think this is so important, adult neutrality and acceptance and child agency. Neutrality in tracking the child's own play and being fully present to the child. So this does mimic EMDR processing in some ways. We're just tracking where things are going. We're not, when we use interweaves to kind of help things bridge for someone, there's many reasons why we're not supposed to do that a lot, right? Certainly validation is important if clients need it, but like we want them to be making the connections. We just want to be tracking what's happening, right? And if we jump in and say, oh my gosh, that sounds awful, like that might be how the client feels, but it might not be the right thing to say, right? So just kind of tracking, wow, that experience with your dad, I saw your body tense up, right? That's different than saying, you must have been so scared, right? So you're tracking, same thing, right? Provide and being fully present, of course, hugely important for EMDR and I think that I'm guilty of this too. Kids, often notice when adults, even though they're quote playing with them, are not being present, And look, it's hard. I'm often trying to pay bills on my phone while I'm also playing Barbies, but I know my kids notice, and that's life in this world that we live in. But like being present, we know that for our adult clients, it's so important. For our kid clients, it's so important. We're sending the message like, you are all that matters right now, right? And we don't get that a lot in the world. And kids, are a great bullshit detectors, so they know right away if you're not present. So providing these elements in the play therapy space allows the child to feel safe to express and process in whatever way makes the most sense to them and feels best, right? Without the pressure to verbally process memories and experiences that might feel impossible to articulate, either because they don't understand them, don't have the words for them, find them too vulnerable, but they still happen to them, right? And play doesn't just have to mean playing with toys or playing in a sand tray, although it can. Processing can happen through drawing or movement, which is also play, through imaginative, like acting things out, role play. EMDR processing does not require the therapist to understand the memory in a linear way, right? Just ask the client to work through it in a way that works for them. And I think sometimes what can happen is clients are trying to create a narrative that we're following, even in EMDR, right? And when a child is playing, it kind of can help us get away from that. Like, and when an adult is playing, right, that like attachment to like, I have to understand what's going on here. Like when I play with my kids, I have no idea what the hell is going on half the time, but that's not the point, right? They're directing the play. They get to feel a sense of control. They get to feel important, all that stuff. Ana Gomez, a lot of you have heard of her, one of the pioneers of EMDR for children and working with traumatic dissociation with children. She uses sand tray as her primary modality of EMDR with children. And Beckley-Forest describes Gomez's approach in the following way. So she's quoting her, and then I'll talk a little bit more about an article by Gomez later. Beckley-Forest says, quote, that she provides invitations to children to create stories in the sand tray, which help to more gradually approach the traumatic memory networks, right? The therapist might begin some initial processing along the networks that the child is not ready to explicitly approach in the metaphor of play by wondering about the thoughts, the feelings, the body sensations of the central character, also known as the self object in the play, and asking the child to notice these along with BLS. So, the child might be like, oh, this is me, or they might be like, this kitten, and the kitten is the central object. Well, the kitten, that's often called the self object. That's usually somewhat reflective of the child, even if they're not verbalizing that. Gomez, like I said, also contributed an article to this issue of Notice That. And this article is titled The World of Stories and Symbols, the EMDR Sand Tray Protocol. So Gomez has an entire protocol on EMDR and sand tray. And in the article, she gives a list of 8 reasons why the incorporation of sand tray in the EMDR protocol makes sense for children. And that like putting them together offers a lot of opportunities and benefits. So together, the combination of them, one, and think as you're hearing these, she's talking about children, but how these also can apply to adults, right? The combination, one, provides distance from the traumatic event, so children are able to bring up elements of what is in conflict for them within the context of a story or a sand world. Think about how we tell people, oh, imagine you're watching it on TV, right? 2, it uses the child's primary language of play. 3, it has the potential for accessing implicit memory and early experiences of adversity that the cognitive mind is not yet able to access, and as a result, these things remain below awareness. Those early experiences are still hard for an adult to access, maybe even harder, right? Number 4, sand tray physicalizes what's, makes physical and externalizes what's conflicting and painful so the inner world can dialogue with the outer world. Number 5, play allows the child and the clinician to initiate processing early, even when the child has not fully acknowledged the traumatic events, right? It can kind of come out through the play. And these issues will emerge as they feel, they will emerge naturally through play. If any of you who've done play therapy have seen, right? And you can have directive play therapy, make a sand world about something that's going on at school, or just make a sand world. My kids therapist calls it a sand world, which I love. Using sand figures like toys and miniatures and sand tray procedures helps the child with dissociative tendencies stay present, especially when the child is in constant movement, bringing figures in and out of the tray. They're so engaged, they have to be present in the moment what they're doing, right? It's that one foot in the present, and it's so they have to be choosing how to express it, and the sand is so tactile, it's very grounding, right? Play engages the right brain, giving children and adults who are verbally constrained by trauma another avenue and channel of exploration. Number 8, this play offers an entrance into the memories of trauma, even when the child has a phobia of the memory. The worlds and stories the child creates may become targets for processing. So again, so many of those things apply to adults, right? And when you're doing this, the child enters elements of the traumatic event with sufficient distance. This is all part of her article, I'm quoting, and without having to own yet what may be otherwise overwhelming. The entrance allows the child to integrate and work through the conflicting areas of responsibility, safety, power, control, without becoming emotionally dysregulated or constricted, hypoaroused, or shut down. How beautiful, right? And how much we need this for play as well. And like I said, she has a protocol. And so some of the elements of the protocol I'll highlight, although I encourage you to read her article and her book and get training if you want to know more. I'll put some links in the show notes, are using figures and the sand to create a safe, calm place, right? In preparation. Using sand to install nurturing, wise, protective resources. For children with major attachment wounding, they can create experiences of nurturance and protection for child or childlike or, maybe baby animals in the sanctuary, getting the kind of nurturance that they needed to get so the child can have that experience of what, caregiving and receiving care can feel like. Everything that they did not receive, they can create that experience. When you get to assessment phases, like everything can be externalized through the central figure, the self object, right? What's the kitty feeling in their body when they think about this experience? Right. As opposed to what are you feeling in your body, right? The sand tray, obviously, or maybe not obviously, but makes sense, can be used to create the target memory or a representation of it. Some questions that Gomez shares that she asks could be, what's the yuckiest part of this sand world for the kitty? Picking the target, right? What is the mixed up thought the kitty has about herself when she looks at the yuckiest part of this world? I'm stupid, or whatever, And then regarding phase 4, Gomez shares this insight. During the processing phases, a child may create in the sand tray a word or a story about the actual traumatic event, and own the cognitive. I think I create. Sorry about that. Let me read what I just said. I think I misread the quote. Regarding phase 4, Gomez shares this insight. During the processing phases, so phase 4, a child may create in the sand tray a world or story about the actual traumatic event and own the cognitive, emotional, and somatic content of this event. However, some children, due to deficits, defenses, trauma-related phobias, lack the complete realization that these experiences happened to them, right? In these cases, the utilization of sand tray strategies in EMDR may allow the child a safe distance to access what might otherwise be overwhelming. And, we're activating the unconscious and the subconscious. The child might be playing out these themes with no recognition that they have connection to these happening, but something internally is dictating that to them, right? And often the therapist will apply BLS to the child while the child is doing the play. It doesn't have to be 45 to 60 seconds. What are you noticing, right? It's an ongoing play. You don't want to interrupt the play, right? Just like sometimes with adults processing, we let them just keep going and talking while the BLS is going if that seems to be working, right? Or just, even if they're not talking, just let the BLS keep going until they feel like they're ready to pause. Gomez has this thought to share about interweaves. All kinds of interweaves are possible in the sand tray that embrace the various levels of information processing. Therapists invite the body, the somatic component of the experience, as an active participant in the process as well. Some interweaves may go from character to self. In this case, the therapist might inquire, as you see the kitty being chased by the lion, like that's happening in the play, what happens in your body? Is there something that you find your body is wanting to do when you see the kitty being chased? I want to get up and run. Go, run, right? So much to say about this. I mean, it's amazing, but I hope you got some ideas swirling around. And I highly, highly recommend that you check out Gomez's work. There's so many ways to do that. She has a great website, books, trainings, if you're interested in this stuff. It's so rich and I think has so much to teach us about working with adults. So just saying a little bit about play therapy more generally and adults. To start with a quote from Winnicott, from 1971, it is in playing and only in playing that the individual child or adult is able to be creative and to use the whole personality. And it is only in being creative that the individual discovers the self. So why aren't we doing this with everyone, you know? Creativity is play. Play is creativity. And what else would we call music, dance, cosplay, role-playing, theater, board games, etc., if not play? Art therapy, right? Psychodrama or empty chair approaches. All of these are playful in that they are accessing creativity and the nonverbal and allowing the client to really dictate where we're going. And just a note, like play therapy can certainly feel vulnerable to adults, right? Especially if you call it play, but it's still play. So there are ways you don't have to call it that, right? But dance, movement, stretching. What about using tarot or other like representational cards? These are all creative outlets. Clay or Play-Doh, and of course, sand tray, right? There are trainings on adults and using sand tray with adults. I love playing in the sand when I have the opportunity. So many of the principles of sand tray can be easily transposed to working with adults. You could add audio BLS while an adult is playing in the sand. They could be wearing headphones, or you could have binaural beats like playing. You could have, there's so many ways you could integrate the BLS here. You could be tapping on them. Right. And so there are trainings on incorporating sand with adults, incorporating play with adults. And certainly you can become certified in sand tray and in play therapy, and I encourage you to do so if these modalities really speak to you. However, you can incorporate these techniques in simple ways on your own, okay? Please don't be afraid to do that. There's no rule, there's no law that says you can't use sand tray if you haven't taken 40 hours of sand tray training, right? And then just a couple examples for my own practice of how I see intensive work pairing beautifully with play of all kinds, whether it's sand tray, working with child parts, drawing, movement. I will say that, like, again, an intensive work's great because you can bring in a lot of different elements over the course of a long time, right? I don't know about you, but when I draw, it takes me a while. So if I have 5 minutes to draw something, that might not be as effective as really having the space to spend the time that I need to spend on it. Or if I'm playing with a fidget or something, or if I'm doing some movement, maybe I want more than 2 minutes of doing that, you know? So myself using art in intensives, I often will draw on techniques from the GTEP protocol. I always say P protocol, even though it's GTEP, in which you have the group participants draw a picture of the worst part of the trauma, use BLS to process it, several pictures in a row as the images changes through processing. Like, that's kind of the overall structure. There's very little verbal processing because you're doing it in a group. I have an entire episode on GTEP. If you're interested, I'll link that in the show notes. So that's an example. You can also use art for safe, calm place. You can use music for safe, calm place. You can pair music and art for safe, calm place. I know some therapists, they're not even technically music therapists, but they have a keyboard or some drums. Drumming is BLS, bilateral stimulation. They have that in their office, right? You can use art to externalize emotions and parts to, like, just instead of saying, like, what does the part look like? Have them draw it out if they want to. Draw a mind map of all the things that come up that when they think about a certain target. I find that with drawing, if I draw a bit along with the client, not what they're drawing, of course, but like engage in a parallel activity if they don't, so they don't feel too vulnerable, right? I might just draw a little bit too, or color a picture, or I will say to them, would you prefer that I work on something else? And then check in with you. Like, I always ask people how they want to do it, because drawing and feeling like they're being observed can feel like vulnerable to people. Some people do like it if I'm kind of observing and like tracking, neutrally tracking, but certainly check with the client about what feels comfortable to them, especially because there's people who are like, oh, I'm not a good artist, I'm terrible at drawing. I mean, that's not really the point, of course, but we all maybe have that like inner art teacher in us who's like, you're not good at this, or our own self, inner critic, right? So there might be a variety of ways to calm that for the client. let's see. And I often incorporate movement, somatics, as we move sensations through the body. And this can be playful. It can be silly. It can be shaky, shaky, shaky. It can be mindful, all that stuff. Another excellent application of play therapy with adults is with dissociative clients. And you all know that I work a lot with this population. So play is an amazing way to draw out child parts. Maybe those child parts weren't allowed to play. Maybe they love to draw and they can express the trauma that they hold that they don't have words for. It can be wild to see like a child part come out and use stick figures, even though you're talking to a 35-year-old person. Obviously connecting with pre-verbal trauma. I often have blocks and magnetiles in my office. So people, and this, like I'm thinking about one client, we did an intensive and she made she used magnetiles and built this bomb shelter that she would get locked in sometimes, which her adult self isn't really knows exists, but doesn't really know much about it. I got a very detailed kind of tour of this bomb shelter from this younger part using magnetiles. Of course, having lots of figurines, right? You want to have a dollhouse or some kind of house, furniture, common figures that we have. And this is with sand and just playing. You don't even have to have sand. You can just have like a floor that's comfortable to sit on. And that's okay. I love sand for the manipulation of it. And you can create like waves and, holes and mountains, but you don't have to do that. You can just have a lot of little figurines. I take them from my kids' old toys that they don't want anymore. They don't know that they have, they don't miss them. Things like family members, community members, vehicles, imaginary creatures, people of all genders, animals, houses, furniture, medical equipment, school stuff, all sorts of things. Just things that might allow someone to express their experiences in a nonverbal way. I've learned to track the play some, but again, it depends on the part that I'm dealing with, or if it's an adult, not going too overboard on that at first, sort of letting them lead and seeing if they respond to you kind of tracking what's going on. But obviously staying very present and attuned unless they kind of want you to, check in with them periodically because watching them might feel too vulnerable. I've been able to draw out experiences that I never would have been able to get from the adult part through using play, right? I've been able to connect with parts that have been hard to connect with for longer. I have a client who has one part that's always locked in a cage, but this part loves fire trucks. And so I had a fire truck there very intentionally. And the child didn't talk to me, this child part, but they came out for over an hour, which was by far the longest I connected with them. Played with the fire truck, acted out this whole nonverbal, they weren't speaking, but this whole scene that I just tracked. And there's also another part that was 3 that I had never talked to before and play drew them out. And and it's so fascinating to see how their play really does look like the play of a 3-year-old, even though I'm talking to, technically an adult, right? I did an intensive not that long ago in which one day I connected with 3 different child parts and got to spend an hour with each. Okay. So I got so much out of this, and every single part got the chance to really feel seen, got the chance to play, which often they weren't allowed to as kids. Got to show me parts of what they wanted me to know in different ways because I had different, I had a variety of toys they could gravitate towards, right? I often have stuffies for a variety of reasons, either to act things out or because it's comforting to somebody to hold. And my adult client, the A&P, after that intensive told me how much more connected she felt to those parts after that session where I connected with those younger parts each for an hour, and how she sensed really profound shifts. So, and how would I have had time to do that I wouldn't have, right? And there was continuity in the play that I saw, themes that emerged for all of the different child parts that maybe I wouldn't have connected. I figured out a lot of things that I wasn't sure about, or I had questions about. It was amazing to be able to bring that back to the ANP when she returned, and because she's not co-conscious with a lot of these younger parts sometimes. So there was just so much that we all got out of this experience. And maybe one of the most important things was how seen a lot of these younger parts got to be, who often don't get to, wouldn't have very much, quote, airtime if it was just working with the adult. So just scratching the surface on a topic that I find so interesting. I'm really drawn to learning more about play therapy and sand tray, and maybe someday I'll have the time. But for now, I'm making my way, learning as I go, applying a lot of what I learned for my own kids to working with adults, right? Again, if you're attuning and you're connected to your client and you're observant, you can't screw this up. You're not going to, it's like you're humble, you try things, you respond to what you see in front of you. Okay. So I feel like we can get into these sort of cycles of like, I'm not allowed to do X because I haven't been trained in it or whatever. Yeah, certainly I'm not going to be going out and teaching people complex yoga poses that I can't do because somebody might get injured. But beyond that, there are things we can all try. I can ask anyone, I can do like side stretches with a client, even though I'm like the least flexible person in the world. I can ask them to do neck rolls. We don't need to feel like we need permission to access some of this stuff. We just, do a little reading, get some consultation, do this with intention, and you can do it. I'd love to know your thoughts on this episode at Future Template Parent on Instagram. And thank you as always for listening. I hope you all have a wonderful week. Take good care.